They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but mine came steaming hot with a side of corporate restructuring that left my former tormentors scrambling for new jobs. The irony wasn't lost on me that the very people who had dismissed my revolutionary idea as naive and impractical were now watching it generate millions in revenue while they cleaned out their desks. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a 26-year-old data analyst named Emma Rodriguez brought down an entire corrupt department at Meridian Financial Solutions, with help from the most unexpected ally imaginable. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when I walked into the gleaming offices of Meridian Financial Solutions, clutching my laptop bag and a thermos of coffee that would prove insufficient for the day ahead. I had been working there for 18 months, long enough to understand the political landscape, but not long enough to navigate it successfully. My cubicle sat in the middle of the analytics department, surrounded by colleagues who treated innovation like a contagious disease. The idea that would change everything had come to me during a weekend of obsessive data analysis. I had been reviewing our client retention patterns when I noticed something that made my heart race with excitement. There was a massive gap in our customer service approach that, if addressed properly, could revolutionize how we handled client relationships and potentially increase revenue by 30%. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, an AI-powered predictive model that could anticipate client needs before they even realized they had them. I spent the next 3 weeks refining the proposal, running simulations, and building prototypes. The data was irrefutable. The business case was bulletproof. I was confident that once I presented it to the department, they would recognize its potential and fast-track it for implementation. How wrong I was. The meeting took place in Conference Room B, a sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. I had requested 15 minutes to present my findings to the senior team, including my direct supervisor, Marcus Webb, and the department head, Patricia Goldman. As I set up my laptop and prepared to begin my presentation, I noticed the skeptical expressions already forming on their faces. "Emma, we appreciate your enthusiasm," Marcus began before I had even opened my mouth, "but I hope you understand that we have established protocols for innovation initiatives. These kinds of blue-sky projects typically require months of preliminary research and approval from multiple departments." I smiled politely and launched into my presentation anyway. For 12 minutes, I laid out the data, demonstrated the prototype, and explained how we could implement the solution within 60 days. The room remained silent throughout, broken only by the occasional tap of fingers on the conference table and the distant hum of air conditioning. When I finished, Patricia leaned back in her chair and exchanged a look with Marcus that I had learned to interpret as the corporate equivalent of an eye roll. "Emma, this is certainly creative," she said, her tone suggesting that creativity was not necessarily a virtue in her world. "But I'm afraid it's not realistic for our current operational framework. We're a financial services company, not a tech startup. Our clients expect stability and proven methodologies, not experimental algorithms." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Besides, the implementation costs would be enormous. We'd need to retrain staff, update our systems, and potentially restructure our entire customer service department. The risk-to-reward ratio simply doesn't justify such a massive undertaking." I tried to interject, to explain that the data showed minimal risk and substantial reward, but Patricia held up her hand. "Emma, I admire your initiative, but this isn't the right fit for Meridian. Perhaps you should focus on the quarterly reports that are due next week instead of these speculative projects." The dismissal was swift and brutal. I packed up my laptop in silence, my cheeks burning with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. As I walked back to my cubicle, I could hear muffled laughter coming from the conference room, and I didn't need to guess what they were laughing about. Over the next few days, word of my naive proposal spread throughout the department. Colleagues who had previously been friendly began treating me with barely concealed condescension. During coffee breaks, conversations would stop when I approached, replaced by knowing smiles and whispered comments about ambitious junior staff who don't understand the real world. The worst part was the systematic way they began undermining my work. Marcus started questioning every report I submitted, finding fault with analysis that had previously been praised. Patricia excluded me from important meetings, claiming that my inexperience made me unsuitable for strategic discussions. Even my peer-level colleagues began treating me like an outsider, as if my failed proposal had somehow marked me as fundamentally different from them. I spent sleepless nights wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was too inexperienced to understand the complexities of corporate innovation. Maybe my idea really was as impractical as they claimed. But then I met David Goldman. David was Patricia's son, a fact that I didn't learn until after our first conversation. He was 29 years old, with an MBA from Wharton, and a reputation for being something of a black sheep in the Goldman family. Unlike his mother, who had climbed the corporate ladder through politics and risk aversion, David had spent several years working for tech startups before reluctantly joining Meridian at his father's insistence. I first encountered him in the break room on a Friday afternoon, hunched over his laptop with a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold hours ago. He was wearing jeans and a casual button-down shirt, a stark contrast to the suits and blazers that dominated the office dress code. His dark hair was slightly messy, and he had the kind of focused intensity that I recognized in fellow data obsessives. "Excuse me," I said, reaching around him to access the coffee machine. "Sorry to interrupt." He looked up, and I was struck by how different his eyes were from his mother's. Where Patricia's gaze was calculating and cold, David's was warm and genuinely curious. "No problem," he said, closing his laptop. "I've been staring at these numbers for so long that I'm starting to see patterns that probably don't exist." "What kind of numbers?" I asked, more out of professional curiosity than politeness. "Customer satisfaction scores, retention rates, service call analytics," he replied, rubbing his temples. "I'm trying to figure out why our client satisfaction has been declining despite increased investment in customer service training." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. "Are you working on the Patterson account analysis?" "Among others," he said, looking surprised. "How did you know about Patterson?" "I've been tracking similar patterns across our entire client base," I said, my excitement building. "The decline in satisfaction isn't because of service quality. It's because we're being reactive instead of proactive. We're responding to problems after they've already frustrated the client." David's expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. "Go on." For the next 20 minutes, I found myself explaining the same concepts I had presented to his mother's team, but this time to an audience that actually understood what I was talking about. David asked intelligent questions, challenged my assumptions in productive ways, and seemed genuinely excited about the potential applications. "This is brilliant," he said, when I finished explaining the predictive model. "Have you presented this to the analytics team?" My face must have given away my disappointment because his expression immediately grew concerned. "What happened?" I gave him the abbreviated version of my failed presentation, leaving out the part about his mother's condescending response and the subsequent office politics that had made my life miserable. But David was perceptive enough to read between the lines. "Let me guess," he said, his tone growing dry. "Marcus and Patricia told you it was too risky, too expensive, and too innovative for a traditional financial services company." "Something like that," I admitted. David was quiet for a moment, staring into his cold coffee. When he looked up, there was something different in his expression, something that reminded me of a predator sizing up its prey. "Emma, would you be willing to show me your full presentation? Not the abbreviated version you just gave me, but the complete analysis with all the supporting data." I hesitated. Getting involved with the boss's son seemed like a potential career-limiting move, especially given my already precarious position in the department. But there was something about David that made me want to trust him, a sense that he actually understood what I was trying to accomplish. "Sure," I said, "but can I ask why you're interested?" David's smile was enigmatic. "Let's just say I have a different perspective on risk management than my mother does." We arranged to meet the following Monday after hours, when the office would be mostly empty. I spent the weekend refining my presentation, adding additional data points, and strengthening my implementation timeline. By Monday evening, I had a comprehensive proposal that was even more compelling than my original version. David arrived at my cubicle at 6:30, carrying a cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in notes. He had clearly been doing his own research over the weekend because his questions were even more sophisticated than they had been in the break room. "Before we start," he said, settling into the chair beside my desk, "I want to be completely transparent with you. I'm not just a curious colleague. I'm Patricia Goldman's son, and I've been brought in to help identify inefficiencies in our current operational model." I stared at him, trying to process this information. "You're Patricia's son?" "I know it's awkward," he said, "but I wanted you to know before we went any further. My mother doesn't know about this conversation, and I'd prefer to keep it that way until I understand the full scope of what you're proposing." "Why?" I asked. "If you're here to identify inefficiencies, wouldn't my proposal be exactly what you're looking for?" David's expression grew serious. "Emma, can I speak frankly with you?" I nodded. "My mother is brilliant at managing existing systems, but she's terrible at recognizing disruptive innovation. She sees change as a threat to stability rather than an opportunity for growth. If she knew I was here, she would shut this down before you could finish your first slide." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But I've been analyzing our company's performance data, and I can see that we're falling behind our competitors in every metric that matters. Client satisfaction is down, retention is declining, and our market share is shrinking. We need exactly the kind of innovative thinking that you're proposing, but the current leadership team is too risk-averse to recognize it." I felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we present your proposal to someone who actually has the authority to implement it," David said. "My father." The mention of Richard Goldman, Meridian's CEO and founder, sent a chill through me. Richard Goldman was a legendary figure in the financial services industry, known for his ruthless business acumen and his ability to identify profitable opportunities that others missed. He was also notoriously difficult to impress and had a reputation for destroying careers that disappointed him. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Completely," David replied, "but I need to see the full presentation first. If it's as good as I think it is, I'll arrange a meeting with him. But Emma, you need to understand that this is an all-or-nothing proposition. If we do this, and it doesn't work, both of our careers at Meridian are probably over." I thought about my current situation, about the contempt I faced from my colleagues, and the systematic undermining of my work. I thought about the brilliant solution I had developed, and the potential it represented. Most importantly, I thought about the fact that David was offering me something that no one else at the company had, a chance to be heard. "All right," I said, "let's do it." For the next 2 hours, I walked David through every aspect of my proposal. He took extensive notes, asked probing questions, and occasionally stopped me to dig deeper into specific data points. By the time we finished, it was nearly 9 o'clock, and the office was completely empty, except for the security guard and the cleaning crew. "This is even better than I hoped," David said, closing his notepad. "The ROI projections are conservative, the implementation timeline is realistic, and the risk mitigation strategies are comprehensive. Emma, this isn't just a good idea. This is a game changer." He stood up and began pacing in front of my cubicle, his excitement palpable. "Do you realize what this could mean for Meridian?" We could increase client retention by 20%, reduce service costs by 15%, and generate an additional $30 million in revenue within the first year. This is exactly the kind of innovation that could put us ahead of our competitors for the next decade. So you'll set up the meeting with your father? I asked. I'll do better than that, David said. I'll make sure he understands the full potential of what you're proposing. But Emma, I need you to promise me something. What? Don't mention this to anyone else. Not your friends, not your colleagues, and especially not my mother or Marcus. If word gets out before we're ready, they'll find a way to sabotage this before it ever gets to my father. I promised, and we shook hands on it. As David gathered his things and prepared to leave, he paused at the entrance to my cubicle. Emma, can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you give up? After the way they treated you, after the way they dismissed your idea, why didn't you just accept their judgment and move on? I considered the question carefully. Because I knew I was right, I said finally. The data doesn't lie. The analysis is sound. Just because they couldn't see the potential doesn't mean it wasn't there. David smiled. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. He left, and I sat alone in my cubicle, staring at the presentation that might change everything. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I had almost forgotten. Hope. The next few days were torture. David had told me that he needed time to prepare his father for the meeting, but he couldn't give me a specific timeline. Meanwhile, I had to continue working under Marcus and Patricia, pretending that nothing had changed while they continued their campaign of professional undermining. On Wednesday, Marcus assigned me to audit a series of client accounts that had been flagged for potential billing discrepancies. It was tedious, mind-numbing work that was clearly designed to keep me busy with meaningless tasks. But as I worked through the account files, I began to notice patterns that made my blood run cold. The discrepancies weren't random errors. They were systematic overcharges that had been carefully structured to avoid detection. Small amounts added to service fees, unnecessary charges for standard procedures, and inflated costs for routine maintenance. Individually, each overcharge was small enough to escape notice. Collectively, they represented millions of dollars in fraudulent billing. I spent the next 2 days documenting everything I found, building a comprehensive case file that detailed the scope of the fraud and identified the specific individuals responsible. The trail led directly to Marcus and Patricia, who had been using their positions to systematically steal from clients while enriching themselves through kickbacks and inflated vendor contracts. The discovery left me in an impossible position. I couldn't report the fraud through normal channels because the people I would be reporting to were the ones committing it. But I couldn't ignore it either, because innocent clients were being robbed and the company's reputation was at risk. That's when I realized that fate had given me the perfect ammunition for my revenge. On Friday afternoon, David called me at my desk. Emma, can you meet me in conference room A at 5 o'clock? I have someone I'd like you to meet. I knew without asking that the someone was Richard Goldman. Conference room A was the executive conference room, an intimidating space with mahogany paneling and leather chairs that had witnessed countless high-stakes decisions. When I arrived, David was already there, along with a man I recognized from company photos and news articles, but had never seen in person. Richard Goldman was in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention without effort. He was dressed in an expensive suit that had clearly been tailored specifically for him, and his eyes had the sharp intelligence of someone who had built a fortune by seeing opportunities that others missed. Emma Rodriguez, David said, rising from his chair. I'd like you to meet my father, Richard Goldman. Richard extended his hand, and I shook it, trying to project more confidence than I felt. Mr. Goldman, it's an honor to meet you. The honor is mine, he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that I couldn't place. David has been telling me about your work, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. We sat down at the conference table, and I opened my laptop to begin the presentation. But before I could start, Richard held up his hand. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to understand something. David has told me that you face some resistance from the analytics team regarding your proposal. I want you to know that in this room, there are no politics, no hierarchies, and no preconceptions. I'm here because I believe in innovation, and I want to hear your ideas without any filters or interference." His words were exactly what I needed to hear. For the next 45 minutes, I presented my proposal with a confidence and clarity that surprised even me. Richard asked intelligent questions, challenged my assumptions, and pushed me to think more deeply about implementation details. By the time I finished, I felt like I had given the presentation of my life. Richard was quiet for a long moment after I concluded, staring at the financial projections on my laptop screen. When he looked up, his expression was thoughtful. "Emma, this is impressive work," he said. "The analysis is thorough, the business case is compelling, and the implementation strategy is well conceived. But I have to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Why do you think Marcus and Patricia rejected this proposal? And please don't give me a diplomatic answer. I want to know what you really think." I glanced at David, who nodded encouragingly. This was my moment of truth. "I think they rejected it because they're afraid," I said. "They're afraid of change, they're afraid of being shown up by a junior employee, and they're afraid of taking responsibility for innovation. They've built their careers on maintaining the status quo, and they see any disruption as a threat to their positions." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's a serious accusation, Emma. Are you suggesting that my department heads are putting their personal interests ahead of the company's success?" "I'm suggesting that they're not equipped to recognize innovative solutions when they see them," I said carefully. "But Mr. Goldman, there's something else you need to know." I told him about the billing fraud I had discovered, presenting the evidence I had compiled over the past week. Richard's expression grew darker with each document I showed him, and by the time I finished, his jaw was set in a hard line. "Are you telling me that Marcus Webb and Patricia Goldman have been systematically defrauding our clients?" he asked. "The evidence suggests that, yes," I said, "and I believe they rejected my proposal because they knew that improved analytics and client monitoring would make it impossible for them to continue their activities without detection." Richard was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the conference table. When he spoke, his voice was ice cold. "David, I want you to call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. Emma, I want you to prepare a presentation that includes both your innovation proposal and your fraud investigation. And I want you to be prepared to present it to the full board of directors." My heart stopped. The board of directors was the ultimate authority at Meridian, a group of powerful business leaders who could make or break careers with a single decision. "Sir, are you sure that's necessary?" I asked. "Emma, what you've uncovered isn't just fraud. It's a systematic failure of leadership that has put our company at risk. The board needs to understand both the problem and the solution." He paused. "And you are the solution." Over the weekend, I worked around the clock to prepare for the board presentation. David helped me refine the documents and coached me on how to present to senior executives. By Monday morning, I had a comprehensive presentation that told the complete story. The fraud, the cover-up, the rejected innovation, and the path forward. The board meeting was held in the executive boardroom on the 40th floor, a space that felt more like a courtroom than a conference room. As I set up my presentation, I could feel the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes studying me. These were people who controlled billions of dollars in assets, who had built empires and destroyed competitors. And I was about to tell them that their company had been systematically robbed by its own leadership. Richard introduced me briefly, explaining that I had uncovered some irregularities that required board attention. Then he turned the floor over to me. I started with the fraud investigation, methodically laying out the evidence of systematic billing irregularities, inflated contracts, and kickback schemes. The room was absolutely silent as I presented document after document, showing how Marcus and Patricia had used their positions to steal from clients and enrich themselves at the company's expense. When I finished that section, one of the board members, a woman named Margaret Chen, leaned forward. "Ms. Rodriguez, this is extremely serious. Are you prepared to testify to these allegations under oath if necessary?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "I have documentation for every claim I've made." "And you discovered this fraud while conducting routine account audits?" asked another board member. "Actually, no," I said. "I discovered it while investigating why my innovation proposal had been rejected by the analytics team." That led me into the second part of my presentation, where I explained how my predictive analytics model had been dismissed and how I believed the fraud was the real reason for the rejection. The board members listened intently as I demonstrated the potential of my solution and showed how it could have prevented the very fraud I had uncovered. When I finished, the room was completely silent. Richard stood up and thanked me for my presentation, then asked me to wait in his office while the board deliberated. I sat in Richard's office for 2 hours, staring out the window at the city skyline and trying not to think about what would happen if the board decided I was wrong. Finally, David appeared at the door. "Emma, they want to see you again." I walked back into the boardroom, where the board members were seated around the table with expressions that gave nothing away. Richard stood up as I entered. "Emma, the board has reviewed your presentation and the supporting documentation. We've also conducted some preliminary verification of your fraud allegations, and we've found them to be accurate." He paused. "Effective immediately, Marcus Webb and Patricia Goldman are terminated from their positions at Meridian Financial Solutions. They will be escorted from the building this afternoon, and we will be referring their cases to law enforcement for criminal prosecution." I felt a surge of vindication mixed with shock. I had expected consequences, but I hadn't expected them to be so swift and severe. "Additionally," Richard continued, "the board has voted to approve your predictive analytics proposal for immediate implementation. We're creating a new position, Director of Innovation Analytics, and we're offering it to you, effective immediately." The room seemed to spin around me. "Sir, I don't understand." "Emma, you've demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking we need to keep Meridian competitive. You saw problems that others missed, you developed solutions that others couldn't imagine, and you had the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most. That's not just good analytics, that's leadership." Margaret Chen spoke up. "Miss Rodriguez, your new position will report directly to the CEO, with a starting salary of $150,000 and a substantial bonus structure tied to the success of your innovations. Are you interested?" I looked around the room at the faces of the board members, all of whom were watching me with expressions of respect and anticipation. 6 months ago, I had been a junior analyst whose ideas were dismissed as impractical. Now I was being offered a director-level position and the opportunity to implement the very innovations that had been rejected. "Yes," I said, "I'm very interested." The transition was swift and brutal. By Tuesday afternoon, security guards were escorting Marcus and Patricia out of the building, while their colleagues watched in stunned silence. The news of their termination spread through the office like wildfire, followed quickly by rumors about fraud investigations and FBI involvement. I spent the rest of the week in meetings with IT specialists, data architects, and senior executives, planning the implementation of my predictive analytics system. The project that had been dismissed as too risky and too expensive was now being fast-tracked with unlimited resource and full executive support. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had laughed at my proposal 6 months ago were now desperately trying to ingratiate themselves with me, offering to help with the implementation and praising my innovative thinking. I was professional and courteous, but I didn't forget how they had treated me when I was powerless. My first major decision as Director of Innovation Analytics was to restructure the entire department. I fired 3 employees who had been particularly involved in undermining my work, and I promoted 2 analysts who had always been supportive, even when it wasn't politically advantageous. The implementation of the predictive analytics system took 4 months, but the results exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Client satisfaction scores improved by 28%. Retention rates increased by 22%. And in the first quarter after full implementation, the system generated an additional $42 million in revenue. But the real satisfaction came from watching the people who had dismissed me struggle to adapt to the new reality. Several of my former colleagues left the company, unable to handle the fact that their former junior colleague was now their boss. Others tried to claim credit for supporting my innovations, but I had detailed records of every conversation and every slight. 6 months after my promotion, Richard Goldman called me into his office for my first performance review. David was there too, having been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Development. "Emma, I want to thank you again for what you've done," Richard said. "Your innovations have not only saved this company millions of dollars, but they've positioned us as industry leaders in predictive analytics. More importantly, you've shown us the value of listening to innovative ideas, regardless of where they come from." He paused, looking serious. "But I also want to apologize. The fact that your ideas were initially dismissed and that you faced retaliation for proposing them represents a failure of leadership that I take full responsibility for. We've implemented new protocols to ensure that innovative thinking is encouraged and rewarded, not punished." "Thank you, sir," I said, "but I want you to know that I don't regret what happened. If my ideas had been accepted initially, I might never have discovered the fraud, and I definitely wouldn't have learned how to fight for what I believe in." David smiled. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Sure. When you first showed me your proposal, did you know that I was Patricia's son?" I shook my head. "I had no idea. I just knew that you were someone who actually understood what I was trying to accomplish. And if you had known..." I considered the question carefully. "I probably would have been more cautious, but I'm glad I didn't know because it might have changed how I approached the conversation." Richard laughed. "That's exactly why we need people like you in leadership positions. You evaluate ideas based on their merit, not on politics or personal relationships." As I left Richard's office that day, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a dismissed junior analyst to the Director of Innovation Analytics. The revenge I had sought wasn't just about getting back at the people who had wronged me. It was about proving that innovative thinking could triumph over entrenched interests, that merit could overcome politics, and that sometimes the most unlikely allies could help you achieve the impossible. The final chapter of my revenge came a year later, when I was invited to speak at the National Financial Services Innovation Conference. The topic was Overcoming Resistance to Innovation in Traditional Industries, and the audience included hundreds of senior executives from companies across the country. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, I saw several familiar ones from my former department. They were there to learn about the very innovations they had once dismissed, probably hoping to implement similar systems at their new companies. I began my presentation with the same data and analysis that had been rejected in Conference Room B 2 years earlier. But this time, instead of skeptical dismissal, I was met with enthusiastic interest and detailed questions about implementation strategies. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of executives who wanted to learn more about predictive analytics and how they could apply similar innovations in their own organizations. Several offered me lucrative consulting contracts, and 2 tried to recruit me for senior positions at their companies. but the most satisfying moment came when Marcus Webb approached me during the networking reception. He had gained weight and looked older than his years, the stress of criminal prosecution and professional disgrace having taken its toll. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying none of the condescension I remembered, "I wanted to congratulate you on your success. Your presentation was impressive." "Thank you, Marcus," I replied politely. "I also wanted to apologize for how we handled your proposal initially. I realize now that we made a mistake in not recognizing its potential." I looked at him for a long moment. This man, who had once made my professional life miserable, who had dismissed my ideas and undermined my work. I could have been gracious, could have accepted his apology and moved on. Instead, I decided to be honest. "Marcus, you didn't make a mistake in not recognizing the potential of my proposal. You made a mistake in being so threatened by innovation that you couldn't see past your own insecurities, and you compounded that mistake by creating a toxic work environment that punished creative thinking." His face reddened, but I continued. "The real tragedy isn't that you missed out on a good idea, it's that you probably missed out on dozens of good ideas over the years because you were too concerned with protecting your position to actually do your job." I paused, letting my words sink in. "But I want to thank you, Marcus. Because if you had been a better leader, if you had been more secure in your position, if you had been able to recognize and nurture innovation, I might never have learned how strong I really am. Your failure taught me that I don't need anyone's permission to be brilliant." With that, I walked away, leaving Marcus standing alone in the middle of the reception, a living reminder of what happens when mediocrity tries to suppress excellence. That night, as I sat in my hotel room overlooking the city lights, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a dismissed junior analyst to one of the most sought-after innovation consultants in the financial services industry. The revenge I had sought wasn't just about destroying the people who had wronged me, although that had certainly been satisfying. It was about proving that innovative thinking, backed by solid data and unwavering determination, could overcome any obstacle. The real victory wasn't just in my professional success or in the downfall of my former tormentors. It was in the knowledge that I had fundamentally changed how Meridian Financial Solutions approached innovation, creating an environment where creative thinking was valued and rewarded. The protocols Richard had implemented were now being studied and copied by companies across the industry, and the predictive analytics system I had developed was being licensed to competitors who had once dismissed similar approaches as impractical. But perhaps the most important victory was personal. I had learned that I didn't need anyone's validation to know my worth, that I could trust my own judgment even when everyone around me disagreed, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply proving that you were right all along. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about David Goldman, whose willingness to listen to an unconventional idea had changed both of our lives. He had been promoted to Senior Vice President and was now leading Meridian's expansion into new markets, using the same kind of innovative thinking that had initially brought us together. David had taught me that allies can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the people who seem like they should be your enemies can become your greatest supporters. His support had been crucial to my success, but it had also shown me the importance of being willing to take calculated risks and to trust people who demonstrate genuine interest in your ideas. The final irony of my story was that the people who had tried to destroy my career had actually made it stronger. Their dismissal of my ideas had forced me to refine them until they were bulletproof. Their attempts to undermine my work had taught me to document everything and to always be prepared to defend my position. And their toxic behavior had given me the evidence I needed to expose their corruption and clear the path for my own advancement. In the end, my revenge was complete, not because I had destroyed my enemies, but because I had built something better than what they had torn down. I had created a culture of innovation that would outlast all of us, and I had proven that sometimes the best way to overcome injustice is simply to be so successful that your detractors are forced to acknowledge your worth. The story of my rise from dismissed junior analyst to director of innovation analytics became something of a legend at Meridian Financial Solutions, told and retold by employees who wanted to believe that merit could triumph over politics. But I knew the real lesson wasn't about individual success or personal revenge. It was about the importance of creating organizations that value innovation over conformity, that reward creative thinking over political maneuvering, and that give everyone the opportunity to contribute their best ideas, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. As I fell asleep that night, I smiled to myself, thinking about all the young analysts and junior employees who would benefit from the changes I had helped implement. They would never know what it felt like to have their ideas dismissed because of their age or position. They would never face the kind of systematic undermining that I had experienced, and they would never have to choose between staying silent and risking their careers to speak truth to power. That, more than any personal satisfaction or professional success, was the real victory. I had not just gotten my revenge. I had made sure that no one else would ever have to go through what I had experienced, and in doing so, I had transformed my pain into purpose and my anger into lasting change. The conference ended the next morning, but my story was just beginning. Over the following months, I would launch my own consulting firm, specializing in helping organizations identify and overcome resistance to innovation. I would work with companies across dozens of industries, helping them implement the kind of predictive analytics systems that had once been dismissed as impractical. And I would continue to speak at conferences and universities, sharing my story and encouraging others to persevere in the face of skepticism and resistance. But that Tuesday morning, when I had walked into Meridian Financial Solutions with my revolutionary idea, I could never have imagined where the journey would take me. All I knew was that I had something valuable to offer, and I was determined to find someone who would listen. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything: a good idea, the courage to persist, and the willingness to accept help from unexpected allies. The rest, as they say, is history.